Since this is a writers' conference, strictly speaking, I should start talking about the 9 books that our next guest, NOAH FELDMAN, has written. Instead, though, I'm going to talk about his podcast series, Deep Background. It is easily one of my favorite podcasts. Over the last few months, NOAH has featured the following guests: the founder of the second largest cryptocurrency, Francis Fukuyama and Fareed Zakaria, to talk about geopolitics, a prominent Palestinian-Israeli human rights lawyer, a reporter from ProPublica on Amazon's labor practices, a senior vice president at Facebook on its decision to ban Trump, and the role played by Facebook's so-called Supreme Court, which, by the way, NOAH had a hand in founding, and a totally engaging series on the history of the Federalist Society, that all-powerful legal organization that has come to dominate the conservative legal establishment. This list alone should give you a sense of NOAH's wonderfully wide-ranging curiosity. If I also tell you that NOAH speaks some 9 languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, Biblic Aramaic, Latin and Greek, of course, French, German, Spanish, and conversational Korean, that in addition to being one of the country's top professors of constitutional law, he is also an authority in Islamic philosophy and law, you begin to get the full picture. NOAH is truly one of the most brilliant and captivating public intellectuals at work in this country today, with a mind that's not only piercingly razor-sharp, but also broad-gauged and humane, which brings me back to the books he's written. 9 books of nonfiction, not counting the compendium of law cases. 4 of them relate to the Middle East, the most recent of which is The Arab Winter, a post-mortem on the Arab Spring. In addition, he's written a wonderfully engaging history of the Supreme Court justices under FDR, a marvelous biography of James Madison, and forthcoming in November, the book that he's going to talk to you about today, The Broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America. It's truly an enormous honor to introduce NOAH FELDMAN to the Writers' Conference.
Thank you, Liaquat, so much for that overly generous introduction. Thank you to Robin, thank you, John, and thanks to all of the extraordinary people who have been making the Sun Valley Writers' Conference so spectacular. I'm just so grateful to be here. Let me begin by acknowledging what I think is pretty clear to people who watch TV and read the newspapers, which is that there's no more pressing debate, controversy in our public lives today than the question of whether our Constitution has slavery and racism baked into it from the beginning, or whether there's an alternative picture of our institutions, our founders, of people like Hamilton and Madison and Lincoln, that presents a richer, more complex, and perhaps less depressing picture of our institutions and where they come from. And this question isn't just a theoretical one or a historical one. It has huge stakes for how we think of ourselves as a people and how we think of ourselves as a country, and for how in the future we can organize and arrange our lives to make our country better than it is today. I wrote the book that Liaquat just mentioned, which is called The Broken Constitution, because I wanted to know what the best answer to this question was. And to do it, I knew I had to go back into history. And what I found there genuinely surprised and even astonished me. What I found was a story much more dramatic, much more outrageous in certain ways, and much more complicated than I learned in school, or that I learned over the course of a career as a student and teacher of the Constitution. So what I'm about to do is tell you the story of how we got to where we are, and I want you to feel with me the surprises that come along with it. These were not things that I was taught in school, and maybe you went to better schools than I did, but I would guess that they were also not things that you were taught in school. Just to give you some highlights before I dive into it, we think our Constitution is, and always was, a higher law, a moral blueprint for how we should live our lives. It wasn't. We think simultaneously that we have the same Constitution that we have always had since 1787, when people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton first drafted it. It turns out we don't. And perhaps most shocking, we think that Abraham Lincoln saved our Constitution. He didn't. In fact, Abraham Lincoln broke our Constitution in order to remake it as something new. And the moment at which he realized that he would have to do that, and the ways in which he did that, are a kind of reversal of the entire trajectory of his life and career up until he assumed the presidency in the spring of 1861. And that's the central surprise to me of the story. Now, in order to get there, I want to take you back to the founding of the Constitution and to start with a proposition that, to me at least, was in certain respects surprising. I had a hint of this when I was studying James Madison and writing a biography of James Madison, but this message came through much more clearly when I went back to study the same materials to investigate the question of slavery. So here's where I'm going to start. Everybody knew that the Constitution of 1787 was a compromise constitution based on Northern whites and Southern whites agreeing to institutionalize slavery in order to keep everybody on board of creating a constitution that would let the country expand westward. Now, the framers hid this in plain sight. There were 3 provisions of the original Constitution that were about slavery. One said, this is probably the most famous one to us today, that African Americans would be counted as 3/5 of a person in determining how many people, how many representatives slaveholding states got. Now, today when we think about this, we think of it through the moral outrage of the idea that human beings could be counted as 3/5 of other human beings, and that's the right moral reaction that we have to it today. But as some of you may know, in the original circumstance, it was actually, if you can believe it, the other way around. The North wanted slaves to count for 0. They wanted slaves to count as 0% of a person, and the South, which wanted to maximize the number of seats it had in the legislature, wanted slaves to count for a full person. They didn't want the slaves to vote, needless to say, but they wanted them to count. And so the Three-Fifths Compromise instantiated a hard-fought debate. And James Madison, to give you a sense again of hiding in plain sight, was proud that he came up with the Three-Fifths Compromise. He thought it was a good solution. He was trying to solve a pragmatic problem, and he found a way to solve it. Alexander Hamilton, and those of you who have seen the musical or seen the film based on the musical know that Alexander Hamilton was no fan of slavery. He may not have hated slavery every bit as much as Lin-Manuel Miranda would like him to have, but leave that to one side. Hamilton said on the floor of the New York ratifying convention, openly, he was trying to convince people to ratify the Constitution. And abolitionists were objecting to the Three-Fifths Compromise and to the other two provisions, which I'll come to in a second. And Hamilton said to them, listen, we could not have had an agreement between North and South without this compromise. It was, quote, an accommodation, without which we would not have had a constitution. The other two elements of this compromise were a promise to preserve the slave trade for at least 20 years before it could be abolished. And then finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which said that if you were a slave who managed to flee slavery and escape to a place where there was no slavery, those northern states were under a duty under the Constitution to catch you and send you back into slavery. And lest you think that was a small matter, several years before this compromise, the Court of King's Bench in England, the most important common law court in the world, had held that if a slave was not in a place where slavery was lawful, that person was no longer a slave. They had actually held that an enslaved person who had been held in slavery by a Jamaican owner of slaves who came to Britain and escaped could not be sent back to Jamaica because he wasn't a slave anymore, because slavery wasn't the law in England. So the Fugitive Slave Clause openly repudiated that basic doctrine. So this compromise was on the surface, and it was known to everybody. And for that reason, even the strongest supporters of the Constitution, even Hamilton and Madison, who wrote the Constitution more or less with the help of others and wrote the Federalist Papers, always acknowledged in their public speaking and writing that the Constitution was a compromise, and because it was a compromise, it was not seen as a moral document even by its supporters. It was a necessary, real-world, pragmatic compromise between people who thought of themselves as men of the world to enable the country first to survive in a unified way, and then, over the next decades, to expand westward. And the reality of that compromise led only a tiny fraction of people to say that the Constitution was so immoral that it should be thrown out. And those people were early abolitionists, both black and white, and they did say very clearly that the Constitution was, as one of them famously put it, an agreement with death and a covenant with hell that is fundamentally immoral, and that the Constitution should therefore just be dropped. Now, why was that such a peripheral view? If lots of people thought that slavery was immoral, why didn't more people think that the Constitution was immoral to the point where it should be abandoned? Well, the answer is they cared about a union. They wanted to have a unified country. And they knew, as a practical matter, they couldn't have that country without this compromise. So they bit their teeth. And they accepted the reality of this compromise. The compromise, however, was remarkably unstable. And the history of the United States from, say, 1820 up until secession and the Civil War in 1860 to 61 is a history of a series of crises. And this, they do teach us in American history, that there were these crises and that each crisis was resolved by you guessed it, a compromise, a big C compromise. These were quasi-constitutional agreements. The Missouri Compromise is the most famous one, but there were more, designed to preserve this unstable balance as expansion led to the creation of new states. And each time a new state was created, they had to decide, would it be a slave state or a free state? And that would change the balance, especially in the Senate. And changing the balance might lead the country to collapse if either the North thought, this is a bad deal for us, we're too compromised with respect to slavery, it's too immoral, or if the South thought, we're not going to be able to expand slavery anymore, and so we would be better off starting our own country. People were talking about the possibility of secession already in the 1820s. So over a 40-year period, the subject on the table was how do we stay together, and the answer was compromise, and the compromise always had the same character. Renew the compromise of 1787, guarantee the continuity of slavery, and facilitate expansion, and just don't worry too much about the moral question. Now, the second shocking thing that I learned, and this I think shocked me even more than the first thing. Abraham Lincoln's entire political career, from the moment he went on the stage as a young man in Illinois, until he was inaugurated President of the United States, up to and including his first inaugural address, which I'll come to in a second, was devoted not to being an abolitionist, but to preserving the constitutional compromise. He was a devotee and follower of Henry Clay, the founder of the Whig Party, the man who was known as, this they also taught us in history, the Great Compromiser. So Lincoln's model was the Great Compromiser, and that literally meant preserve the constitutional compromise. So while African American abolitionists and white abolitionists were arguing about whether the Constitution should be read as what it historically was, a pro-slavery document, or should be read against the grain, creatively and counter to the facts, as an anti-slavery document, which was a live argument among black abolitionists at the time, albeit among a small number of people, Lincoln had no interest in that debate, none. Because it wasn't practical, and it wasn't pragmatic, and Lincoln was a practical person and a pragmatist. And above all, Lincoln believed in the Constitution. So in a very famous speech that Lincoln gave as a young man called the Thelyceum Speech, which he gave to a group of young, upwardly mobile people like himself in Springfield, Illinois, he talked about the Constitution, and he said the biggest danger faced by the country, the gravest danger faced by the country, was that people would start disobeying the law and disrespecting the Constitution, and that might lead them to emancipate the slaves. And in a shocking line of that address, Lincoln said, "We don't want there to be someone who is like a Caesar, who acts as a dictator and either enslaves free men or frees enslaved men." So Lincoln's prime example in this speech of what would go wrong in the United States that would break our Constitution and ruin everything was that someone would emancipate the slaves on his own authority. I mean, it's almost too good to be true. You know, you can't believe that the guy actually said this. You know, if it were the Truman Show, you would say, you know, that's a clever scriptwriter. It's Aaron Sorkin level prefiguration. So that's what he says in this speech. Okay, so that's the young Lincoln. You say, well, but surely later on in his career, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, let's say, and when he was running for president, surely then Lincoln repudiated slavery. Nope. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln repeatedly said that it was his firm and absolute belief that the United States government, not the president, not Congress, no part of it could touch the question of slavery. Slavery was wholly within the jurisdiction of the states, Lincoln insisted. And he ran for president on that platform. And now we come to his first inaugural address. So picture, if you will, being in the Lincoln Monument. I'm sure everybody's been there. And as you look to your right on the wall, you see Lincoln's second inaugural. And you look to the left, and you see the Gettysburg Address. And in the middle is that, you know, mega Lincoln. Lincoln as a god, right, enshrined in the temple of our democracy. So where's the first inaugural address? Well, it turns out that if you read it, and you know, you can look it up on the internet, so this is not some historical revelation that was unknown, this is just about actually reading the thing. The first sentence begins with Lincoln saying that he's absolutely devoted to the preservation of the constitutional right of slaveholders to hold their slaves forever. That's it, that's the first sentence. Because Lincoln is trying to hold the country together. He's trying to reverse secession. Secession has happened, but the first shots haven't yet been fired on Fort Sumter. We're not yet at war. He, by the way, has no army at all. And what he's thinking is, how do I get these folks back? And the answer that he came to was the same one he'd had his whole career. Renew the compromise over the Constitution. That compromise is a promise to the South. Don't worry, we're not going to stop you from having slaves. Don't worry about it. Come back. So that is how he started his presidency. Now, here comes the third surprise, which is the surprise about Lincoln breaking the Constitution. So we all know that when the South seceded, they believed that seceding was perfectly permissible under the Constitution. They thought the Constitution was a contract or an international treaty, and they said if one side breaks the treaty, the other side is no longer bound by the treaty. And they said just electing Abraham Lincoln was enough to break the agreement. And they said, we're really worried that the North is going to block us from expanding slavery. That broke the deal. So according to them, they were acting within the bounds of the Constitution. And in fact, another fascinating thing is if you look at the Confederate Constitution, they just based it on the old US Constitution with one difference, they said. And this was explained in a famous speech by the vice president of the Confederacy. It's called the Cornerstone Speech. He said, our Constitution is exactly like the old Constitution, except that it is based on the cornerstone, his word, of the scientific knowledge that white people are superior and supreme over black people, and that the natural state of black people is to be enslaved. That's the only difference, he said. Okay, so that's the context. And we're all taught that Lincoln, in contrast, said, you can't break the Constitution. The Constitution isn't broken. You haven't really seceded. But in fact, Lincoln had to break the Constitution in three crucial ways that are almost invisible to us, even though they were so heavily debated and discussed at the time. So first was the decision to go to war at all. Where in the Constitution does it say that if some states secede, the other states can raise an army and coerce them to remain? Trust me, it doesn't say that anywhere in the Constitution. And you can guess why it doesn't say that in the Constitution. Because the Constitution is a document about self-government through democracy. And in a democracy, you don't force people to participate. They participate by their consent. And the South said, well, we don't consent anymore. We're out. And indeed, the administration of James Buchanan, the outgoing president, had issued a formal opinion signed by the Attorney General, and then repeated by Buchanan in his last State of the Union address, saying, look, we don't think the South has the right to secede, but if they do, our right to do anything about that under the Constitution is non-existent. We're stuck. We can't do anything about it. I mean, that was actually, it's kind of amazing. The position of the President of the United States of America while secession was happening was, okay, bye guys. And Lincoln had to develop the theory out of nowhere that the government had the coercive authority to force the southern states against their will to participate in a democracy based on the consent of the governed. That was breaking the Constitution, and he did it. I won't belabor the point here, but there's lots about it in the book. Second, Lincoln decided on his own authority to suspend the right of habeas corpus, which is the right that says that if the government grabs you up and arrests you, they have to present you, usually within 24 hours, to a court of law and explain what charge you're being held on, and eventually try you before a jury of your peers and convict you, or they have to let you go. Some people call this the right of rights. It's the right that stands between a rule of law system and a system of dictatorship. Lincoln said, yeah, we can't do that anymore. So I'm authorizing my military to arrest essentially anyone they want. And as a consequence, over the course of the next 4 years, the Lincoln administration imprisoned somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 people under military detention with no trial, typically, for criticizing the war effort, for saying that peace was a good idea, for saying the South should be allowed to be let go. Hundreds and hundreds of newspapers were shut down. Hundreds and hundreds of newspaper editors were arrested and imprisoned. And we just don't tell the story anymore. We don't even talk about it. The most famous of the prisons where they held people was called Fort Lafayette. It was in New York, in the harbor, just off of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. And if you look for it today, unfortunately, it's gone because the Verrazano Narrows Bridge needed a foot to sit on. And so they took the piece of land that it was on, the little island, and they knocked down Fort Lafayette, and they put up one of the 2 feet of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. But that's where it was. And this was called by its critics the American Bastille. And in a great New York Times article, the New York Times said, it's not a Bastille, it's more like a hotel with a beautiful view. And then that same article went on to list 200 people whom the article called political prisoners being held there. This was a supportive article saying, oh, there's 200 prisoners there. It's more like a hotel, though. I don't think it was very much like a hotel. Now, you might say, well, probably no one objected to this. Well, actually, the Chief Justice of the United States issued an opinion saying that Lincoln lacked the authority to suspend habeas corpus and that he had violated the Constitution, and insisting that Lincoln reverse this. And what do you think Lincoln did? He ignored him. Ignored him. That was Lincoln's second breaking of the Constitution. Now we come to the third and really the most dramatic breaking of the Constitution, the one with the most important consequences for how we see the Constitution today and for our future and for the high-stakes issues that I was talking about. And this was Lincoln's decision, which he only reached a year and a half into the war, to issue a proclamation, again on his own accord, with no authority from Congress, to emancipate all enslaved people living in the Confederacy. As I'm sure a lot of you do know, it did not apply to enslaved people living in the Union, and there were enslaved people living in the Union because several of the states that remained in the Union were still slave states. Like Maryland, for example, was still a slave state, and the Emancipation Proclamation did not free enslaved people living in Maryland, but it purported to free enslaved people living in the Confederacy. Now, not only did Lincoln say in his first inaugural address that he didn't want to do this, but shortly after Lincoln became president, in the summer of 1861, a man called John C. Fremont, who was a fascinating kind of picaresque adventurer, who was a general under Lincoln. He had been the Republican nominee for the presidency in 1856, so before Lincoln. In those days, it was really common for generals, for important politicians to be made generals. So Fremont was an important politician, he was made a general. The minute that an enslaved person crossed the lines from the Confederacy to the Union in Missouri, which was where Fremont was the general, Fremont issued a proclamation saying, these people are now free. He said, indeed, anyone who is enslaved by a rebellious slaveholder is now free. Sound familiar? That's the Emancipation Proclamation, but a year and a half before Lincoln did it. What did Lincoln do? Well, first he wrote Fremont a letter saying, this is dictatorship, Lincoln's word, reverse your order. Fremont was a politician, and he said, nope, I won't. Lincoln said, okay, I'll reverse it. Lincoln publicly reversed Fremont's Emancipation Proclamation, and then he fired Fremont. So that's where Lincoln was at the beginning of the war. But a year and a half into the war, he reached the realization that he needed fundamentally to change the constitutional structure because he needed the war no longer to be a war to recreate a compromised constitution that was not based in morality, but based in pragmatic self-interest. And to do that, he announced his own Emancipation Proclamation, and for the first time said, the war is now a war to end slavery, and we will not accept the capitulation of the South without an end to slavery. A transformative and extraordinary decision for Lincoln to have reached. He deserves all the credit that we give him in our history books for this decision to emancipate. And he did it because he realized that the war could not be won on the grounds of a return to the old compromise constitution. Now, here's the thing. This act was an epic breaking of the Constitution as Lincoln had understood it through his entire life. It wasn't a new interpretation of the Constitution. It was a frank breaking of the Constitution. And if you think that nobody noticed that that was a breaking of the Constitution, a retired Supreme Court justice who was no Southern sympathizer, but a liberal Supreme Court justice at the time who had recently retired, the guy who had dissented in the famous the famous Dred Scott case, a Massachusetts man, a former Harvard Law School graduate, Harvard College graduate, wrote a long book explaining why the Emancipation Proclamation was totally unconstitutional. And in fact, Lincoln himself worried that if the Emancipation Proclamation was ever put before the U.S. Supreme Court, the justices might overturn it. He was very worried that that might happen. The justices themselves were afraid that if they did that, they'd go to jail. So, they were at a standoff. So Lincoln's act transformed our Constitution from a document that at a fundamental level was either at best amoral, but to honest people immoral, into something that suddenly could be moral. And to memorialize that, Lincoln, in his last public act, presided over the political process of getting the 13th Amendment to the Constitution passed, the one that prohibited slavery. And that's the story that we hear in Dars Kearns Goodwin's great book and in the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln. It's a tremendously dramatic story. It's a great movie. It's a great book. It's a little less dramatic because the reason it was so close is that Lincoln was still dealing with a Congress that had been elected at the beginning of the war, or earlier in the war. And everybody knew the new Congress had already been elected. They just hadn't sat yet. And there was a huge Republican majority in the new Congress, and they were absolutely 100% committed to passing the 13th Amendment. So it was going to get passed anyway, but that would not have made for a good movie script. So this is Lincoln's sort of ultimate vindication of his breaking of the Constitution with respect to slavery. Now, interesting, the government did not vindicate Lincoln's decision to break the Constitution with respect to habeas corpus. The judgment of history of the Supreme Court and others is that Lincoln was wrong and went too far in doing that, and that only Congress has the authority to suspend habeas corpus in wartime, not the president acting on his own. So it's not that all of Lincoln's breaking of the Constitution had this kind of transformative and permanent moral weight. I want to be really clear. I mean, Lincoln was an extraordinary person who absolutely did the right thing at the right moment. He deserves all the credit in the world for that. But he wasn't a god in real life. He was not perfect. I mean, I suppose neither are the Greek gods. But, you know, Lincoln was capable of error. And not only that, Lincoln also had beliefs, values, and attitudes that, judged by the standards of today, are not consonant with our commitment to racial equality. That's okay. That is the world in which he lived. So after Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, he was very worried about getting uptake from white Northerners over it, because he knew that many white Northerners were worried about the possibility of blacks and whites being able to live together. And he himself, throughout his life, said publicly that he did not believe that blacks and whites would be able to live together in harmony. And his solution for this was a solution that went all the way back to the early 1800s and had been embraced by Henry Clay, among others. And that was the idea that people of African descent should be, by their consent, to be sure, transported to Africa or Central America, where they would form colonies and their own countries. An idea that was actually ultimately tried in the case of Liberia, famously, and did not work out very well. At all points where Lincoln espoused this view publicly, and he never stopped espousing it until even a year after the Emancipation Proclamation, no African Americans wanted to go, essentially. I mean, it was basically a fictional, kind of a fantasy. But it was Lincoln's belief. And Lincoln delivered that message loud and clear, including to a delegation of African American leaders whom he brought in to see him in the White House so that he could tell them in front of reporters, basically, I'm paraphrasing, that the war was their fault because white people were fighting each other over them. So it was their fault. And that they therefore should agree to being transported out of the country. They were not happy about this formulation. They were polite but rejected the idea. Frederick Douglass was a lot less polite. He said that Lincoln's comments to this delegation of African Americans was outrageous, fundamentally morally wrong. He said it was like one person steers another person's horse and you blame the horse for the theft. So, I'm using this to show you that Lincoln was a human being, a product of his times, who nevertheless accomplished this extraordinary transformation. So let me come now to what it would mean for us today to accept the story that I'm telling you as basically historically true. What are the practical real-world implications of accepting this story? And I just want to be clear, I think one of the reasons the stakes are so high is that some people, maybe some of us, I think I sometimes felt this way when I started writing the book and in the process of it, felt worried that if we admit to the world, if we admit to ourselves even worse, that the Constitution was in some way born as a compromise over slavery, and that it took the breaking of the Constitution and its reformation for us to get rid of that, that we will lose our capacity to feel unified as a country, to feel proud of ourselves, to feel proud of our origins, and to feel proud of our possibilities for improvement in the future. I think that is an understandable impulse. And I say that as someone who cares a lot about the Founding Fathers, who spent years of I spent my entire middle 40s writing a book about James Madison, who was, I think, one of the great geniuses of political history and was a slaveholder. I think that the answer is that ultimately we are much more capable of pride in ourselves, our institutions, and our possibilities as a people if we are honest with ourselves and admit to ourselves and the world that we changed. That the Constitution that came into existence in the aftermath of the Civil War was indeed a moral constitution with an aspiration to equality embedded in the 14th Amendment, with an aspiration to equal voting rights embedded in the 15th Amendment. A moral document, a blueprint for a moral nation. Now, does that mean we've always been a moral nation? Obviously it doesn't, because a blueprint is just a blueprint. You have to follow it to fit into its categories. And we haven't always followed the 14th and 15th Amendment perfectly. In fact, for a long period of time, in the 1880s and 90s, and really up to the Civil Rights era, we, to a certain extent, ignored the commands of the 14th and 15th Amendments through segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans. It took the Civil Rights Movement and African Americans themselves demanding the equal rights enshrined in the moral Constitution for us to do better. But that is okay too. I don't mean okay that it was morally all right. It wasn't. What I mean is the fact that having a moral blueprint is hard to live up to is okay. We created, through breaking the original Constitution, a moral Constitution that we can try to live up to, that exemplifies the values and goals that we want to have. And when we look forward to our future as a unified people, and we all know that we need to be a unified people, we need it desperately, we know that that future is not going to come together in unity if it's based on a compromise that we know in our hearts is not okay. We all know that. We know it intuitively. That's the lesson of the Civil War. That is the core lesson. A compromise that we knew wasn't really okay didn't ultimately work. And through the blood of the soldiers of the Civil War, Lincoln himself claimed in his second inaugural address and then in the Gettysburg Address and then in the second inaugural address, through the blood of the soldiers on both sides who died, we were able, Lincoln said, to cleanse ourselves of the original sin of slavery and to transform ourselves into something new. So for me, the takeaway of the story of the broken Constitution is that it needed to break, and after it broke, it was remade. And by being remade, it gave us a Constitution that is a higher law, that is in aspiration, a way we can go forward into our future. Because now we can test ourselves against it. Now we can say, do we do a good job of equality? If so, we're fulfilling the demands of the 14th Amendment. If we don't, we aren't. Do we do a good job of enabling every American to vote? If so, we're living up to the demands of the 15th Amendment and the aspirations of the 15th Amendment. And if not, we don't. That's why you have a morally aspirational blueprint there, to compare yourself to it, to try to do the best that you can. So if this book in any way is able to contribute anything to the ongoing and intense debate that we have, I hope it's that we can tell the story honestly, truthfully, and openly, and that should make us stronger as a country. And it should enable us to do better and to live up to the moral commitments that Lincoln found his way to, that are embedded in the higher moral constitution that we have, and to which so many of us believe we need to dedicate ourselves as a people in order to live the best lives that we can. Thank you, and I'm very eager to hear questions.
I don't know about you, but I want to go back to school and sit in Noah's class.
Thanks, John.
So we've got about 15 minutes for questions about the book and the story you just told, or about other aspects of constitutional law.
Any question is fine.
Anything of that site. Please raise your hands. There's a question. Yes, there's a mic right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
With what's going on in Republican legislatures today, and without a specific block in the Constitution against that, what's the future of democracy?
I'm glad you started with a nice, easy one. You didn't hear me being deeply nonpartisan? So there's a real debate right now in the country. So let me start with what we're not debating. Everyone in the United States accepts as a matter of principle today that if a state legislature anywhere were to pass a law that was intended to make it harder for people of one race to vote, or one ethnicity to vote, or one sex to vote than others, that law would violate the 15th Amendment and be unconstitutional. Everyone agrees on that. And the Supreme Court agrees on that. And I think it's a firmly established proposition. What we're debating is whether laws that as written don't mention or implicate race or ethnicity or sex, but make it arguably somewhat harder as measured statistically for some people to vote than others, should be considered violations of the 15th Amendment or not. So just a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court decided a case about an Arizona law that in its terms had basically two provisions, one of which said that if you vote at the wrong polling place, your vote doesn't count, and the other of which said it's against the law for someone who doesn't work for the state of Arizona to go around collecting ballots to be mailed in as mail-in ballots. Okay, those are the two provisions. And the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, I'm very sad to say, divided along ideological and sort of partisan lines, the conservative majority said, these laws don't violate the Voting Rights Act because although they have a very slight, statistically disproportionate effect on black voters, about a percentage, about 1%, it's about 0.5% for Latino voters, they were not designed to achieve that goal, they haven't been shown to achieve that goal, and the Voting Rights Act shouldn't be interpreted, according to the Supreme Court, to read that law as applying here because the percentage was small and the effects were not clearly demonstrated. That's what the Supreme Court's majority said. The three dissenters said, are you kidding? Have you been watching television? A lot of elections are decided by a lot less than 1%, especially presidential elections. Every vote counts. And they said, you should be able to treat the disparate racial impact of this law as a reason to strike it down under the Voting Rights Act, which itself implements the Constitution. So that's the structure of the debate in a case like that one. You know, I think that reasonable people could differ about the outcome in that case. I know which side I favor, but I think that reasonable people could differ about it. And when it comes to the debate about partisan gerrymandering, where by hypothesis we're not talking about race at all, we're just talking about laws designed to make it easier for Republicans to win or for Democrats to win by lining up voters, I think those laws are awful, whoever does them, and I think the 15 or so states that use nonpartisan methods for choosing voting districts have it right, and I would like all 50 states to do it that way because that seems like a fair way of doing things. But the Supreme Court was invited for a period of 20 years to say that partisan gerrymandering was unconstitutional, and they didn't. So it's not unconstitutional under the current Supreme Court's rulings, and that means if states want to do it and get away and think they can get away with it, they can. So what we're left with then is a policy argument that it's better to let everybody vote. And to my mind, you know, it's a democracy. We're supposed to be able to vote. Our votes are supposed to be able to count. We all in principle believe in the one person, one vote principle. So I think it would be preferable for us to do it that way.
Thanks. Yes, up there.
Could you comment on current issues under the First Amendment generally, and in particular around people foreclosed from being able to access communications by private sector actors who have significant control over methods of communication.
Yeah, thank you for raising that issue. In the same period of time that I was working on this book, over the last 3 or 4 years, that issue that you're talking about, the First Amendment and its relationship to social media, has been my other main life preoccupation. I think Liaquat mentioned that I worked to help build the Facebook Oversight Board, and that came out of my concern. My proposal for that came out of my concern for a world in which private companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and so forth, are in a position of deciding what speech is or isn't permitted on their platforms. So let me just say a word or two about how I come at the issue, but obviously people can disagree. First, the First Amendment only applies to the government. That's common consensus of everybody, right, left, and center. Right? The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It doesn't say Twitter shall make no law. Right? So under Supreme Court doctrine, the only people who can make claims, the only way you can make a claim under the First Amendment is if the government has shut down your speech. If a private actor has shut down your speech, you can't. They call this the state action doctrine, and when I teach it to my students, I tell them it's the simplest doctrine, and I can tell you that because I taught it to my kids when they were 5. Because my kids know I teach the First Amendment, and so when I told my kids to be quiet, they would say, "Dad, you're violating my freedom of speech." And so I would say, well, actually, I'm not. You don't have a free speech right against me because I'm not the government, so sorry, you have to be quiet anyway. One year I even brought in my daughter, she was 8 at the time, with her whole class to visit my grown-up class. And just to prove a point, I had my daughter explain the state action doctrine. I was very proud of her. Okay, so that's the state action doctrine. So that means that if Twitter or Facebook or another platform deplatform Donald Trump or somebody else, Donald Trump doesn't have a First Amendment claim against them because they're not the government. Okay, that's sort of the 101. Next point, if you're a private company, under a little case you might have heard of called Citizens United, you also have free speech rights. That means, and this is me talking, this is just my view, that under the Constitution, if a private company chooses to allow some speech and disallow other speech, it is exercising its First Amendment rights to do so. It has a First Amendment right to make that decision. Now, not everybody thinks that it should be that way. And in addition here, there's the question of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives the platforms the right, not the right to speak, they already had that right from the Constitution, but it gives them the right not to be sued if they choose to take down content or leave up content. And that could be changed, and Congress could change that. My expectation is that eventually that will be changed. But even after that's changed, at least in my view, the platforms will still have the right to make these decisions. Now that frames the problem as a really serious one. Because if these big platforms can decide what's said on their platforms, and if they have a constitutional right to do so, then a lot of what we say is going to be shaped by what they do or don't allow. And to my mind, that puts a very strong moral duty on those companies to think long and hard about their terms of service, about their rules for what speech is allowed. And I'll be blunt, I don't think those decisions should be made ultimately by those companies. I think they should be made by independent people who don't work for those companies and who aren't subject to the political pressures of the moment, who can't be pushed around by either a Trump administration or a Biden administration. Because it's risky that a governmental administration will try to push the social media platforms to say what it wants them to say. You know, we all saw the news reports of that alleged that Donald Trump had tried to threaten that he would block the Time Warner AT&T merger unless CNN were shut down or thrown out of the deal. And that, to me, is a real threat to free speech. And just in the last week, we saw the Biden administration blaming the platforms, Twitter and Facebook, for the fact that they haven't taken down all of the COVID misinformation that's out there. And the president actually said, quote, "They're killing people." That's an overt form of pressure on the platforms to take down speech that is free. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you think it's false or true. My own personal view is that COVID misinformation is not true, but it's still free speech under our Constitution. You can say false things in our country, and I don't like the idea that a governmental administration could pressure these private actors to take down speech, because it's not the job of the government to achieve by pressure what it would not be allowed to achieve by direct legislation. The government can express its view, but it shouldn't be pressuring too actively. Now look, this is a delicate question on both sides, and it's a genuine problem going forward that we're going to have to keep on dealing with. But I think my own view is the answer comes from public input, from keeping the platforms honest, and from making sure that the platforms take that decision-making authority ultimately away from themselves. You know, I think that's the best way to go. That's my own view.
Good, thanks. Yes, right down here. The microphone's coming. Down in the keep coming. Right, can you keep your hand up? Yeah, thank you. Here it comes.
I would just like to have you comment on, excuse me, why it took so long for women to get the vote.
Well, let me begin by acknowledging the huge importance of the question, and saying that a full theory of why men have tried to, and have in many cases successfully oppressed women since the beginning of our recorded history is way beyond my expertise. I know it's true, and I'm very interested in the processes through which it's happened. But you're absolutely right. And, you know, there was a very famous moment in which Susan B. Anthony and some of the other important early advocates for suffrage and also for women's equality had to decide what to do about the 14th Amendment, which extended equal rights to everybody but to all persons. So they favored it. Then came the 15th Amendment, which extended the right to vote to black men but not to women. And ultimately, Susan B. Anthony and some of the other really important suffragists, we wouldn't call them suffragists yet because just for historical reasons they weren't quite there, but early advocates for women's rights. I mean, maybe you could call Susan B. Anthony that. I guess probably you should. They opposed the 15th Amendment. This was where Frederick Douglass, who was one of the only men present at the Seneca Falls Convention and had worked very hard as an abolitionist to build common ties with white feminists, proto-feminists, parted ways. You know, he said, look, you guys really do need to support the 15th Amendment. And Susan B. Anthony was a tragic choice for her, but she said, look, if it's not going to include us, we're not going to support it. We want equality for black people, but we want to be included. And it shows you something that even with the depths of the white supremacism that existed in the minds of many people in the middle of the 19th century, enfranchising African American men still came before enfranchising women. Right? It took another 70 plus years. So that tells you something about entrenched attitudes and how slow they are to change, although I'm not telling you something that you don't already know perfectly well and much better than I. So, you know, I think that's the story. I will say, and this is one of the things I also really enjoy doing in researching the book, women were very active voices on all sides of political debates that I've talked about, and I spent a lot of time in researching the book getting their voices out and putting them into the book. So, for example, Angelina Grimke, who was one of the very important early feminists and early abolitionists, argued already in the 1840s that if you read the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution, you would see that slavery was unconstitutional. Right? So she said the preamble says the government is here to establish liberty, but slavery is the opposite of liberty, for example. Now, historically speaking, she understood that the framers were not trying to end slavery in the Constitution, but she thought it was tactically correct to insist that the earliest Constitution was actually an anti-slavery document. This was a big debate at the time. Frederick Douglass famously was on all sides of this debate. He started thinking the Constitution should be condemned as a pro-slavery document. Then he said it's a contradictory document. And then ultimately he reached the view that it was a better idea politically to say that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, as Angelina Grimke did. Another fascinating woman whose voice I learned about is called Anna Ella Carroll. And she was a very fascinating, controversial figure who wrote a series of long books justifying every extension of power that Lincoln engaged in. She was a kind of public propagandist and theorist for the Lincoln administration. And the historians can't make up their minds about whether she was the unacknowledged further female member of the cabinet, as some say, or whether she was a crank and an apologist and a racist, as others say. Maybe all of it is true. Who knows? People are complicated. So there were women actively participating in all of these debates, even though they weren't formally permitted to participate in electoral politics.
We have time for one more question. Liaquat, right? Here's a microphone.
Did the founders imagine the Constitution would be easy to change? I.e., did they think it would be relatively simple to get new amendments, or did they envisage the sort of situation we're in now where it's almost impossible?
They thought it would be very hard, and those who designed that part of the Constitution, Madison in particular, they wanted it to be hard. In a famous debate in letters that we have, because they wrote letters to each other, Jefferson and Madison fought this out over about 4 or 5 letters. And it had to be in writing because even though they were very good friends, Jefferson was in France when the Constitution was drafted. Now, Jefferson was a big believer in the idea that the earth is for the living and we shouldn't be able to be bound by the dead hand of the past. And he thought that every 19 years, which is what he reckoned a generation was, we should throw out the Constitution and start from scratch. And then anything else was unjust. And, you know, Jefferson was a genius and a brilliant expositor of his ideas, and he spent a lot of time trying to explain to Madison, who was his sort of junior partner, that Madison had gotten this completely wrong. And Madison wrote back saying, look, if we revisit the Constitution every 19 years, there won't be any certainty or stability, and no one will ever invest in anything. And we won't have the kind of ongoing nation that we need, and no one will follow the rules in the Constitution. And so then Jefferson said, well, you know, at least it should be easier to amend. And Madison said, listen, you were not here. This Constitutional Convention only succeeded by a miracle. And a miracle may not happen again. This is also why Madison did not want a separate Constitutional Convention for the Bill of Rights. He wanted that to be done by Congress and sent out to the states because he was terrified about the possibility of a second convention at which the whole thing would fall apart. And when you think about that question, it's a really interesting question for today because most people think that our Constitution is too hard to amend. And, you know, I tend to agree. We've made it very hard to amend. But then you have to ask yourself, let's just imagine that tomorrow there were a Constitutional Convention held in the United States. It wouldn't be in secret like the last one was. Couldn't do it that way. You would elect representatives from every state. Every state would have an equal vote, which is what happened at the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't proportionate to population, right? The tiny states had the same amount of say as the big states. I don't know. You want to roll the dice? Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.